Thank you all for being here this evening and welcome. We're so glad to have you here with us tonight. We're very excited to be hosting a very important conversation about the recent federal actions impacting the education system and what they could mean for Chicago's public schools, our students, and our communities. Before we begin, just a quick note on the language access. So this webinar is offered both in English and in Spanish. If you haven't already, please take a moment now to choose your preferred language channel using the interpretation feature in Zoom. We've got a handy picture here for folks to be able to see how to do that. We've also emailed all registrants, both the English and the Spanish versions of tonight's presentation, so you can follow along in whatever format works best for you. I'm also just going to drop those links into the chat right now as well, just in case you missed the email. Again, thank you for joining us. We're grateful to have you, and we look forward to the conversation. We're going to wait just a couple of more minutes as we've got folks coming into the meeting right now. Again, everyone, thank you for joining us. We're excited for a great presentation here this evening. Please do choose your preferred language channel. Interpretation, this program will be available both in English and in Spanish. I just dropped links into the chat for the English presentation. We also have the Spanish presentation as well, so you can follow along, whatever format works best for you. Thank you. Probably go ahead and get started around 5:35. I know folks are still coming in from the workday, from picking up students from school. And then, I don't know, Dan and Ariel, what the weather's like in DC right now, but it's about a 75-degree, beautiful day, sunny day here in Chicago.
It is beautiful and sunny where I am, and I could not be more grateful for it.
And it is gloomy and has been raining nonstop here in Washington, D.C.
Oh, Dan, I'll be there tomorrow, so I'll get to enjoy the rain with you. I saw it's raining all week. A rainy reconciliation week of markups.
Thank you again, everyone, for being here. Again, you can choose your preferred interpretation channel for whatever language you would prefer. And then I'm going to go ahead and just re-link the presentations again in the chat. This presentation will also be recorded, or is being recorded right now, so we'll share that link with everyone after the meeting. We're going to go ahead and get started this evening. So my name is Hal Woods. I'm the Chief of Policy here at Kids First Chicago. We are so glad that you're here with us this evening. This is going to be really an important conversation that is a collaboration between several organizations who are deeply committed to equity and excellence in public education. I want to thank our partners for their leadership and partnership and bring this conversation to life. We've got Education Council, National Parents Union, Advance Illinois, and Educators for Excellence Chicago. We've come together because we believe that this moment calls for clarity, urgency, and collective action in our education system. Tonight's conversation is focused on what's happening at the federal level and what those shifts could mean for Chicago students, families, and public schools. We know these issues can feel distant or abstract because they're happening often in Washington, D.C. So our goal here tonight is to connect the dots clearly and directly and to make sure everyone walks away understanding what's at stake and what they can do about it. So let's dive in. So here is a quick look at what we'll be covering this evening. We'll start with a short welcome and some context about why this conversation matters right now, especially for families, educators, and communities here in Chicago. Then we'll introduce you to our speakers who are leaders in education policy and advocacy who will walk us through what's happening at the federal level. And we've structured the conversation around 4 key areas. So we'll be looking at the effort to abolish the U.S. Department of Education and what that would actually mean for public schools. Next, we'll dig into how diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI programs are being targeted and the impact that these attacks could have on local efforts to promote equity. We'll talk about the risk of rolling back civil rights protections, particularly if enforcement shifts from the Department of Education, the Department of Justice, but there's also some of the actions that the Civil Rights Division has been taking since the new administration came into office. And finally, we'll also discuss the very real threat of federal funding cuts and what they could mean for students and schools here in Chicago. After we walk through the content, we'll pause for a quick live poll to hear from you directly, and then we'll close with a call to action and share a few concrete steps on how actions that you can take moving forward. We know this is a lot, but we also believe this conversation couldn't be more timely or more important for Chicago education stakeholders. So let's get started. So let's start with the big picture. Why are we having this conversation now? So in just a few months' time, we've seen sweeping federal actions that threaten the very systems and protections that our schools rely on. First, there was an executive order to abolish the U.S. Department of Education. And while Congress would need to formally approve that, the administration is already taking steps to hollow out its core functions. That includes reassigning responsibilities, canceling grants, and signaling that federal support for public education is no longer a priority. At the same time, we're seeing civil rights protections being scaled back, particularly for students and educators. There's been a push to move civil rights enforcement out of the Department of Education and into the Department of Justice, which would make it harder for families to file complaints and slower to get justice. Federal funding is also under threat. The administration is considering deep cuts to Title I, Title III, IDEA, Head Start, and other programs that help schools serve students from low-income families, students with disabilities, and English language learners. And that last point is really key. The programs that are most at risk are those that support students of color, students with disabilities, LGBTQ+ youth, and English language learners. So students who already face the steepest barriers to opportunity. So these federal decisions may feel thousands of miles away, but they have very real and immediate consequences for schools, families, and communities here in Chicago. So what does all this mean for Chicago? Chicago Public Schools depends heavily on federal funds, and we'll get into this, but about 10% typically of funding for CPS comes from federal sources. And while the majority of CPS's budget does come from local and state sources, there are specific federal funding streams, so Title I, Title III, we'll get into those a little bit, IDEA and other targeted programs that are essential to meeting the needs of the district's most vulnerable students. So these are not kind of extras or add-ons. These really fund core supports. It could be teachers, counselors, special education services, family engagement programs, and more. CPS also serves a high concentration of students from historically marginalized communities, including Black and Brown students, English language learners, and students with disabilities, as well as students from low-income families. These are precisely the groups that are most likely to be affected by federal rollbacks on funding and civil rights protections. And if we see these supports disappear or to shrink, the result is predictable. We'll see potentially widened opportunity gaps, fewer staff and services in the schools that need them most, and real harm to student learning, mental health, and well-being. And that's why families, educators, and communities must be prepared to respond, to raise our voices, demand accountability, and to protect the policies and resources that make public education more equitable. These actions could have a real effect on what our kids see and feel every day at school, from the adults in the building to the supports that they receive. So before we jump into the content, we would love for you to take just a minute to complete a quick opening survey. This is going to help us understand where everyone is starting from, what you already know, what you're concerned about, and how you're thinking about these issues. It's completely anonymous, and we'll share what we learned with the group later in the webinar. So you can scan the QR code on the screen to get started. I'm also going to drop a link into the chat that folks can also access directly. We're going to give folks about a minute or so to fill out that form before we keep moving. But really, we appreciate you taking the time to complete this. So as folks are completing those surveys, and thank you for coming in and taking the survey, I want to remind everyone that we do have Spanish language interpretation on by clicking the little interpretation icon in your Zoom. You'll be able to listen in to our interpreter. So before we dive into the content, I want to take a moment to introduce the speakers who are going to be guiding tonight's conversation. Each brings deep expertise and a real commitment to helping families, educators, and schools navigate what's been happening at the federal level. So we have Dan Gordon, who is the principal at Education Council. Before that, Dan had served in multiple leadership roles in DC public schools, including as senior advisor for school design, deputy chief academic officer, and chief of staff to the chief administrative officer. Earlier in his career, Dan was a lead English teacher in Washington, D.C., and a trial attorney in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, where he enforced federal education anti-discrimination laws. He holds degrees from American University and from Harvard, and is an alum of both AmeriCorps and the Broad Residency. Thank you, Dan, for being here this evening. Next, we have Ariel Taylor-Smith, who is the Senior Director of National Parent Union's Policy and Action Center. Ariel brings a wide-ranging perspective shaped by over a dozen years in education as a high school teacher, a community organizer, and now as a parent of a first grader in Denver public schools. She's organized alongside parents to change Colorado's state accountability framework and expanded access to high-quality school options. Her work has always centered families, especially those pushing for change in systems that have historically underserved them. We're grateful to have them both with us here this evening. So with that, to kick it off, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Gordon, who's going to walk us through the Trump administration's efforts to abolish the U.S. Department of Education. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Hal, and thanks to everyone for who put this meeting together and everyone who's here at the end of what I'm sure has been a long day. I should have included in my bio that, like Ariel, I'm also a public school parent. I have children in 5th, 8th, and 11th grades here in DC, and I'm really happy to be here. But talking about some challenging topics. So the first topic for me is what the Trump administration is doing towards the Department of Education. And the question that this slide is, how do we know that this is a priority for the administration? Well, they've been very clear about it. So the quote in the middle of this slide came from when President Trump first nominated Linda McMahon to be the Secretary of Education. And you see there at the bottom of that part, they said, why would you nominate her if you're going to get rid of the department? He said, because I told her, Linda, I hope you do a great job and put yourself out of a job. I want her to put herself out of a job. This has also been clearly stated as a goal in Project 2025, which some of you may remember, especially from the campaign, sort of set of policy ideas for the administration to follow, and was an explicit part of the Republican Party platform as well. So we know this is a priority. So the question is, it's one thing to have a priority, it's another to take action on it. So next slide. I want to talk about, there's sort of two paths to how the administration might work towards accomplishing that goal. The first path that I'll talk about in a second is eliminating the Department of Education in law, like officially eliminating it so that there isn't another one. I'll talk about that in a second. And then I'll come and talk about the second path, which Hal mentioned in his introduction, related to eliminating it in fact. So in the day-to-day life of Americans, what is the current state of the Department of Ed? So let's look at the first path. As Hal mentioned, this should require an act of Congress, and that because Congress created the Department of Ed, only the Department of Ed can eliminate it. The other thing is that this would lead to a full elimination. The agency would go away. But there are lots of federal laws that assign certain functions to the Department of Ed. There's things about student aid, and there's things about providing funding to public schools, all sorts of things. And so those functions, those things that are assigned in law, wouldn't just disappear. They would have to be reassigned by Congress. So you can imagine Congress passing a law saying no more Department of Ed, but that law might also say, and this is where IDEA should go, and this is where career and technical education should go, et cetera. The part on the right side of the little table here is that in terms of, is this going to happen? It's unlikely to pass, especially if it were to go through a normal procedure in Congress, which would require 60 votes in the Senate. That means that it would require Democrats to agree, and nobody thinks that the Democrats in the Senate would vote to go with the Republicans to eliminate this. I said it's unlikely and it's a little uncertain because there is a possibility. There are some ways that you can pass laws through Congress that don't require 60 votes in the Senate, that only require 50 votes, or you could imagine that they get rid of the 60 vote rule, which is called the filibuster. I think most people that watch these things think that's unlikely, but if there's one thing that we've learned in the last couple of months is that, we have to be open to new possibilities, and things that we thought were the way things operate aren't necessarily always the way that they operate. But in general, and I think Ariel would agree with me that this is an unlikely thing to happen. It's important to know that the president said it and is taking steps towards it, but it's unlikely that we'll see the complete elimination of the Department of Ed. So then that brings us to the path number 2, which is what are they doing right now to hollow out to the agency or to eliminate it, in fact. So these are things, and I'll talk about what these things are. These are things that the Department of Ed can do on its own. It doesn't lead to a full elimination, but it can lead to a partial elimination. And at some point, you kind of come to the point of saying, well, if they've cut and cut and cut, or hollowed out and hollowed out and hollowed out, are they still even a functioning agency? Are they able to fulfill the obligations, the responsibilities, the jobs that Congress assigned to them? And ultimately, frankly, that's something that's going to be decided in court. There are already lawsuits that are saying, hey, these cuts you're making make it impossible for you to do the job that Congress assigned you. And so we'll see there. The last thing that the sort of big categories of what they're doing is we may see some action by the administration to take some of those functions, those jobs, and transfer them to other federal agencies, or at least try to. It's something that President Trump said that is going to happen immediately, but that immediately was like a month ago, and we haven't seen that action. And so it's a little unclear about how much they're going to try and push moving things from the Department of Ed to other agencies now, as opposed to working with Congress and hoping that Congress passes it. And that's the note I made there on the right, is that a lot of this is already kind of happening in a combination of ways that are totally legal and within the department's authority, and then in some ways that are probably illegal and go beyond their authority. And so that's where right now the courts are coming into play quite a bit. Okay, so let me talk to you about a couple of the specific things that they're doing. So this is just a list of, not a full list, but a list of a bunch of things that have happened so far. So one is there is an executive order that President Trump made that called for the elimination of the Department of Ed. But let me just pause, and before I talk about that, one of my big messages to folks when I talk about what's happening in Washington is we have to kind of separate what we call separate the signal from the noise. So the noise is like what you see in a headline or what you hear from someone who heard from someone. And, in this instance, President Trump, passed this executive order and poof, the President Trump got rid of the Department of Ed. That's the noise. The signal, the thing you got to really listen for, is what did he actually say? So go beyond the headline. What did it actually say? The executive order said, to the maximum extent appropriate, this is lots of lawyer talk, to the maximum extent appropriate and permitted by law, he asked the Secretary of Education to take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the Department of Ed. That's a lot of things between saying he wants something and actually having it done. And so this could be read as like Secretary McMahon, we want you to go and do stuff tomorrow, Or it could be read and said, we know that Congress has to pass this law, so take a bunch of steps to come up with a plan. You know, where would civil rights go? Where would English learner support go? Where would special ed go? So those could be the kinds of steps. The last thing I'll say about executive orders is executive orders do not create new law. Congress creates laws by passing laws. The courts, like the Supreme Court, sometimes interprets the law and changes, you know, well, it doesn't necessarily mean this, it means a little bit like this. And even federal agencies can go through a very formal rulemaking process to create new laws that we call regulations that have the force of law. Executive orders do not change the law. They are effectively like a memo from the president to everyone who works for him saying, this is how I want our federal government to work. But they can't, you know, he doesn't just have the power to snap his fingers and change the law. So that's my little, you know, speech about executive orders. But it's a big deal that he made this executive order. So then what have they actually done? Well, they've done a lot to hollow out the agency. The number one thing they've done is fire half of the people who work for the Department of Ed. US Ed is already one of the smallest federal agencies. And if you compare the amount of money that it's responsible for, especially with student aid for you know, college students, the amount of money compared to the number of people that work there, it's one of the leanest or sort of smallest staffing to money ratios that we have. But they cut half of the people. They also fired all sorts of folks who work on anything related to diversity, equity, or inclusion. They fired people who are called probationary employees, who are folks who are like within the first year or two of working there. They did a bunch of different things calling for a real reduction in what's going on. And some of these reductions are really meaningful. So we're going to talk a lot about civil rights enforcement. There are 12 sort of regional offices around the country that handle all the complaints of discrimination that come in, and they eliminated 7 of those 12 offices. So they didn't sort of move the people to the different offices, they just cut it. So there's just a lot fewer people available in the federal government to help protect your rights. Next, they also have done a lot of cuts. So there are lots of grants and contracts, especially things around preparing teachers, around recruiting and preparing a more diverse set of teachers so that the teaching force better reflects the communities that we're educating, and lots of grants related to education research and to data collection. These are just sort of the initial areas that Elon Musk's Doge group and the Secretary of Education, and also at other places like the National Science Foundation, have just cut and cut and cut lots of grants and contracts. Next, I told you that it's unlikely that Congress will take action here, but that doesn't mean that Congress is being quiet. There have been what we call in Washington marker bills, which is not necessarily a bill that's going to become a law, but rather something someone wants to put out there to be able to talk about it and campaign on it. And so we've seen these marker bills introduced in the House and in the Senate. But like I said earlier, we're not really expecting them to go anywhere. And one more. And then the other thing I just want to flag is that this isn't only about the Department of Education. There are major reductions in other really important agencies that affect communities and students and directly schools. The Health and Human Services, you know, where lots of early childhood offices, including Head Start, exist, have had a 25% RIF. Not as much as the Department of Ed, but still a massive, massive cut. That includes 5 of the Head Start regional offices. So I don't know if I'm sure we have folks here who benefit from Head Start or are really concerned about early childhood. This is a major area of concern. AmeriCorps, the National Service Program, I'm a 2-time AmeriCorps Corps member, so this is very personal to me, has been almost completely gutted. And about 40 to 50% of AmeriCorps members work in education roles as tutors, as after-school folks, as teacher assistants. So a lot of the cuts that are happening in other parts of the government are also a sort of part of that hollowing out or reducing of the federal role of education. Before I finish this part, a couple things about what to expect next in this area. So first, I mentioned that there's lawsuits. There are at least 4, and I probably need to update this. I think there's at least 4 lawsuits that have been filed that are directly about the RIFs. Sorry, I shouldn't speak in acronyms. A RIF is a reduction in force. It's just the term that's used for when you fire a big group of people. So that 50% cut or at Department of Ed has been challenged in court. And the executive order calling for the closure of the Department of Ed has been challenged in court. So what's next is we'll start to see what the courts have to say about these lawsuits. Next, we'll potentially see action in Congress. Ariel will talk later about some of the potential cuts to funding. Maybe we'll see action in terms of eliminating the Department of Ed. More likely, we're just going to see some really significant attempts to cut public education funding from the federal government. And then finally, one more help. We may see some of these ideas that I mentioned about taking some things that are currently assigned to the Department of Ed and moving them over to other agencies. One of the ones that Hal mentioned and is very relevant to what we'll be talking about next is around civil rights enforcement. The Department of Ed has its own Office of Civil Rights that people can file individual complaints with, and they investigate and they try and figure out, was there a violation of law? And then if so, how do we work with the school district or the state or whatever the group is to improve things? That's pretty different than the Department of Justice, where I started my career, which is lawyers bringing lawsuits in court. And typically it's much easier to get your complaint considered and to get support from the federal government going with the Department of Education and the Office of Civil Rights. The Department of Justice has fewer people, and it's a much bigger deal to bring a lawsuit than it is to launch an investigation. And so one concern is that if they do move more of the work from the Department of Education over to the Department of Justice, it will sort of close off a lot of the ways that the federal government can support people. I'll be back later after Ariel has a chance to talk a little bit more about civil rights enforcement and the ways that the Trump administration is really changing the way that we even think about it. But first, she's going to share with you some more specifics about how they're targeting diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's what I want to share. Hal, let me know. Are we going to pause for questions or move on? How should we
I know we've got one question in the queue right now, and this might be a tough one. I think that the latter part would be an interesting one particularly, but there's a question around what can really be kind of reasonably accomplished in a 2-year term for Trump, or even I would even ask, if Congress switches parties going in, in the midterm in 2026, and then kind of a follow-up question is how quickly could these changes actually return back to their original form with a new presidency after Trump's 4 years?
Sure. So the first part, right. So there's, halfway through the 4 years of the presidency or midterm elections, and the House of Representatives in particular is very, very close. And people, who get paid a lot of money to make predictions about this, see there's a real opportunity that Democrats might take control of the House. That would change quite a bit in terms of all sorts of things about the way that Congress functions. To be honest, though, how a lot of the things that I've been talking about don't rely on Congress at all. Right, it's the administration taking action. They're cutting things here and firing people there. And Congress isn't really involved in that. Now, I also said that some of those things are likely illegal, that go beyond the authority. We're not seeing that really hold them back from trying things. What we're seeing is that they're trying lots and lots of things, and then some of those things are getting stopped by courts. In terms of hollowing out the agency, I suppose in 2 years, if the Democrats took over, then they could have the power to hold hearings and conduct oversight, and they could do all sorts of things to draw attention to it. But in the end, a lot of the decisions about how an office is run or who's employed by that is stuff that the Trump administration can do on its own. I'll tell you, though, just anecdotally, sometimes, for example, I mentioned that some of the probationary employees, folks in the first year or two were fired. And in some parts of the government where that's happened, courts have said, no, you didn't follow the right procedure. You have to bring those people back. Well, a lot of those people don't want to come back. They've lost their job. They've moved to other parts of the country. They've started to move on with their lives or found new jobs. And these are, human people, human beings that we're talking about. And it's not as easy as just turning a light switch back on. And so it's true that some things can be reinstated if there's a change in policy. But that's not going to always be the case. There are people who've been fired who have decades of experience and are the country's, most knowledgeable experts about parts of education policy, about the way the Department of Education works, about why the department does something this way, because we used to try it. We used to do it this other way, but here's why we changed. And it's really hard to imagine replacing some of that. And, you know, some of those folks were close to retirement and have taken, you know, the very reasonable decision to go ahead and retire, and they're simply not going to come back. So we're in this period of transition, and there's a lot of uncertainty, but some of the frankly, the damage that's been done is going to be very, very hard to come back from.
Thank you. Just one last question, a topic I know that's near and dear to you, but there's a question around just the number of AmeriCorps members who are likely to lose their roles, and just kind of getting a sense of the scale of that. There's a follow-up that's about just the impact in Illinois, but I won't try to ask you specifically about the state of Illinois. We can take that question and try to answer it
Yeah,
on the inside.
I don't know the number, so I don't want to pretend. My understanding, it looks like Ariel might.
I think it's a $400 million cut to the agency.
Yeah. And so like some like the NCCC, if folks know that program, which operates in lots of places in the country, I know that the NCCC core members were told to stop working immediately. I don't have a sense of how that's playing out in Chicago or Illinois, but I'm sure that we can get that information to folks afterwards.
We're going to transition now to Ariel.
Can I say one thing though?
Oh,
it's
yes.
a good example. It's a good example. You know, when I got out of college, I was in AmeriCorps, and I worked as a teacher assistant in a 5th grade classroom in Atlanta. And you know, you hear about these like cuts, and so you know, as an AmeriCorps member, maybe I would lose my AmeriCorps experience. But then you think about, well, who's being affected by that? You know, and so because I was in that 5th grade class, the teacher I worked with was able to have, you know, 2 different reading groups. You know, and so you take me out of that classroom, and all of a sudden the teacher doesn't have that opportunity. So, you know, there's the ripple effects of cuts is not just the person working for the federal government, but all of the people that that person was serving in their day.
Thank you, Dan. We're going to turn now to Ariel Taylor-Smith from National Parents Union, who's going to walk us through a little bit about how DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion programs are under attack from the Trump administration.
Awesome. Thank you all. Hi, everyone. Good to see you tonight, and thank you for taking the time to learn about the changes in the federal government right now. I think it's really important that we're really being looped into all of the things that are happening. Today is an extra crazy day on the Hill. If you've been monitoring, they're in the process of doing 3 of the most important markups, which I'll talk about later. The first thing I want to talk about, though, is what we call at the National Parents Union an attack on belonging. We have seen the Trump administration threaten state funding, and obviously through DOGE, take away a lot of grants that have to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. At National Parents Union, we believe that students should have the ability to see themselves in school, celebrate themselves in school, and learn about themselves in school. And so a lot of the initiatives the Trump administration has decided are problematic, are initiatives that we wholeheartedly support at NPU. One of the things that was an action that's notable is that the president, there's a couple of things. The first is that President Trump issued an executive order that gave agencies plans, the direction to come up with plans to eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion programming. And very specifically, the Department of Education then issued a Dear Colleague letter that said that states have to end programming that treats a person differently than another person, and told states that they had to certify that they had made a plan to complete the elimination of DEI programming in their schools. And gave them a deadline. It was important to see states across the country push back and say, no, we're not doing that. And ultimately, there was a judge in New Hampshire that granted a preliminary injunction And so federal funding should remain flowing for these programs in your state. It's really important that if you're seeing freezes, and I do know that Chicago is one of the examples. I've had some conversations with Daniel about this, but if your state's seeing freezes, we want to know about it because the litigative strategy is really important on this. You can go to the next slide. It's Dan touched on this, but it's really important that everybody continues to remember that the executive branch can't write federal education law. Dear colleague letters are not law. They lack the authority to change established and statutory principles. And the role of the executive branch is to execute the laws that are enacted by Congress, which is especially important, especially as a lot of the programs that are coming into question have been programs that have already been funded by Congress. And so that's something that we're watching very closely. You might have seen last week, there was a big cut to mental health support programs that were established during the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And so we're right now monitoring whether or not we believe that those should be released based on the fact that Congress has already appropriated the money. Okay. Next. Great. I think I'm tossing it back to Dan, and then I'm coming back to tell you all about Congress's drama today, which is probably it's
Right.
the best part of the call.
Yeah, and we end with drama and money. So I want to talk about the situation with civil rights enforcement. So the federal government, one of the key roles, people say, a lot of people don't understand what the Federal Department of Education does. Well, one thing is they pass a lot of money that the federal government invests. The Congress, says we want to spend on education. They pass it down to states and communities, school districts like CPS. Another thing they do is like administer all the student aid for as students are pursuing education after high school. Another is they, among other things, do a lot of data work and research around what's working and for whom in education. And one of the key functions, the last one I mentioned, is protect our civil rights. There are federal civil rights laws, and the federal government and the Department of Education have a really, really important role in making sure that people's rights are protected, particularly people most vulnerable. So I'm going to talk about two sort of aspects of what we see now that we're just over 3 months passed into the administration, about ways that the Trump administration is reversing the way that we think about civil rights enforcement and the way that they're accelerating the way that civil rights enforcement works. So first, I want to talk about sort of, this is a little bit more about the reversal, about what is the Trump administration's priority. So traditionally, civil rights enforcement, as I said, is about, comes out of the civil rights movement. It's about protecting the rights of people who have been most marginalized by our society and by our government, people who are furthest from justice. And that in our society tends to be Black and brown folks and other people of color. It tends to be people with disabilities. It was often women, English learners, Native Americans, all sorts of, our community is very familiar to you. The Department of Justice, my old office in the Civil Rights Division, had an internal memo that was shared in the media saying that we need to hire more lawyers. So they look for other lawyers in the Department of Justice to come into where I started my career in the educational opportunities section. And they said we need more staffing to do the administration's priority work in combating anti-Semitism in schools. This is mostly what we see in higher ed, like the sort of fights against Harvard and Columbia, things like that. Title IX. So this is one of their priorities, mainly around issues related to transgender students. I'll talk about it a little bit more. And then a mention there about discriminatory college admissions practices. And so that's more about what Ariel was just talking about in terms of efforts to advance diversity, to advance equity, to advance inclusion, and the administration kind of reversing it and saying, no, like we're not sort of worried so much about discrimination against people, against Black and brown folks. What we're worried about is discrimination against white folks, and then sometimes they'll include Asian students as well. And so it's this reversal of things. So the priorities for the administration in civil rights are anti-DEI, so vindicating the rights of mostly of white students. Title IX, which is mostly about issues with related to transgender students. And then also a real focus on anti-Semitism. And so concerns with the way that college campuses are responding to anti-Semitism on campus. So that's what we see as the real priorities for the administration. So let me talk a little bit about how we're seeing that play out. Okay, so on the reversal side, this is kind of what I'm seeing. This isn't written down somewhere. Well, maybe it's written down somewhere, but this is more what we just see. The first step is to reduce the capacity of the federal government to do civil rights enforcement. So I mentioned that they fired about half of all the people that work at the Department of Ed. Some offices were not very touched, and some offices lost a lot of people. The Office of Civil Rights lost a lot of people. I mentioned 7 out of 12 regional offices around the country were just completely eliminated. The second step is to then take whatever is remaining of the capacity and push all of their work towards the things that I mentioned are the administration's priorities. So you don't see the department announcing investigations into concerns about students with disabilities, or about discrimination against Black students, or about not providing appropriate support to English learners. We don't see any of those kinds of things being announced. What we see are lots of investigations around the issues that I mentioned, around anti-Semitism, around transgender students, and around I'll just call it reverse racism. Step 3 is what we're starting to see a little bit, and I predict that we'll see a lot more, is going to prior agreements or settlements of cases or consent decrees that happened under prior administrations, and undoing them and saying that, this is no longer something that we as the federal government think is a problem. And so we're going to pull out of it. There's 2 examples I want to flag for you. One is at the Department of Justice, so my old office. There's maybe 100 or so old desegregation cases that are still active because there's still concerns that the Department of Justice is working on to help the school districts remove. The Trump administration the other day announced that in Louisiana, they went into court and said, we want to dismiss one of those cases. We expect, I think it's safe to say that we'll see that same thing happen with many other cases. At the Department of Ed in South Dakota, there was an agreement put into place some time ago between the Department of Education and a school district in South Dakota around discrimination against Native American students. And the department showed up there and said, you know what, we don't actually want to still be a part of this. We're dismissing this agreement. Now, the folks that work in that school district said, well, through this process of working with you, we came to terms with what was happening to our students, and we agreed to do A and B and C, and we think A and B and C are good things, and we're going to continue doing them. The thing I'm worried about with step 4, if you can hit it, Hal, is what's going to happen when school districts like that say, we want to keep doing these things. This is a maybe. This is not a definite. But what we might see is the administration say, well, those things you're doing, those things are discriminatory. That those things, because they help, in this case, Native Americans, or if they help students of color, are, and this is not me, Dan Gordon speaking, but the sort of mentality that we see in the administration is that if you help one group, then you're necessarily hurting the other group. And so what we might see is that not only might they come away from some of those agreements, but they might turn around and say, you have to stop doing A and B and C, which were things that you agreed to do to help address past discrimination. So that's sort of the scenario that I'm most concerned about, and that I think we'll see play out over and over. So that's the reversing of the civil rights enforcement. Let me talk briefly about the accelerating. They are moving much, much faster than civil rights enforcement typically ever happens in the government. They may be going too fast, and we'll see if courts step in and say, hey, you're skipping these steps, and these steps are really important. We're also seeing, and what I mean by that is that they're sort of going from announcing an investigation to concluding an investigation very, very quickly. You see the federal government operating in multiple directions all at the same time. So I have the picture of the Maine flag there. You may have seen that the governor of Maine got into kind of a public argument with President Trump around issues related to transgender female athletes. And within a week, 6 different federal agencies had launched investigations into Maine. So they're sort of happening all at the same time. And then the last thing about the acceleration is we're seeing a real comfort in threatening to take federal funds from institutions and then actually taking them. Taking federal funds or saying that an institution or school district is no longer eligible for federal funds is almost never heard of. And we've already seen them say to Harvard University, we're going to stop and take over $2 billion in research funding. And we've said to Harvard University, you're no longer eligible to get federal funds. They're pursuing Maine in court to say that because of these a handful of transgender women athletes, we think that the state of Maine should no longer have access to any federal funds, no Title I funds for low-income students, no IDEA funds for special education students. So a reversal and an acceleration. Next, Hal. The other thing I wanted to flag is that, as I'm sure you know, Chicago and Illinois seems to be a real center of the administration's focus. On the Title VI side, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which is the law that prohibits racial discrimination, we saw lots of things happening with colleges, but we hadn't seen anything in the K-12 area until they announced an investigation into Chicago public schools about the Black Student Success Plan. Followed shortly after that, an investigation was just announced recently into the Evanston-Skokie School District. And the reason I bring that one up is it's a long-standing argument back and forth about the school district's diversity training and anti-bias training for students and teachers. And the thing I want to just flag for people is that part of the complaint there isn't just about policies, but about curriculum, about specific books that are being taught and specific lesson plans that are being taught. And there are many federal laws that prohibit the federal government from getting involved in decisions around curriculum. And so what we might see in this Skokie-Evanston case is a conflict between how the federal government, how the Trump administration is thinking about civil rights law, and how the Congress has said it's not appropriate for the federal government to get involved in questions around curriculum. And then on the Title IX side, this is around sex discrimination. As I mentioned, it's almost entirely about transgender students' participation in sports or access to facilities like bathrooms and locker rooms that align with their gender identity. They've launched investigations into the state of Illinois, into Chicago public schools, and to Deerfield public schools. So you all probably know better than I do, but for several reasons, Chicago is a real point of emphasis for the new administration. Okay, next, Hal. So just quickly, in terms of what's next, we may see new guidance around taking a recent Supreme Court case that was about college admissions and saying that the administration thinks that what the Supreme Court said about admissions should apply in lots of other places. We also are very likely to see lots of more investigations launched. There are many fewer people working in the federal government, but it's harder to do the work of a real investigation, but it's very easy to launch one. And the last one, Hal, many lawsuits. So the topics around DEI that Ariel spoke about, and all of the things that I just talked to you about, many of them are already subject to several lawsuits. And the lawsuits are all at the beginning stages. Over the next several months, we'll see those lawsuits proceed from those initial stages into final decisions. And I think we're going to go to Ariel now.
And just one quick thing. I know, Dan, we're going to get to it towards the end, but someone was just asking the Education Council has a listserv they can join. So we'll be sure to send that link. I know that there's a great center, kind of a hub of different resources. Education Council, we'll share that at the end. But thank you for that. And then there was just a quick question, Dan, about the role of the group Parents Defending Education. And how can, like, essentially the question is, in the OCR play in these lawsuits against anyone doing programming that centers non-white students?
So, and anyone can file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights, and groups like Parents Defending Education are filing complaints. Something that we don't often see, but we're seeing now, is that when the administration announces a new investigation, sometimes in the press release, they're even getting a quote from the group or the individual who filed the complaint. That's it's very unusual. It's not illegal. It's just it's really different. And so I think I don't want to take up too much time, but there's some very close coordination between those groups and the administration. Some of you may be familiar with the group Moms for Liberty. I noticed the other day there was a video that was put out on Mother's Day by the Department of Education, but it was the head of Moms for Liberty talking about things and sort of speaking in terms of we, and which is, sort of goes to the question. Folks who are centering students, it's a long and complicated question, and I probably will just direct you to some of the resources, but there's absolutely here's the thing I want to say. Nothing that President Trump does with an executive order, or that the administration does with, like, the kind of guidance that Ariel was talking about, changes the law. Guidance can provide you with guidance about, oh, if you do it this way, we think that's okay. But they can't take something that is lawful, that is okay, and by snapping their fingers, make that thing illegal. That's not the way that our government works. But it's very hard to stand up and say, I still believe this is legal, and I've talked to my lawyers, not Dan Gordon. I'm not your lawyer in this webinar, but we think this is legal, and we believe in it. And it aligns with our mission, it aligns with our values, and we're not gonna what we call preemptively comply. We're not gonna change something that aligns with our mission and our values simply because you don't like what we're doing. But that's very easy for me or Ariel to say on a webinar, and it's much harder if you're working in a community and you're in a nonprofit or in a school, and you're worried about the whole federal government, coming at you like they did to Maine or to Harvard University. So I don't want to pretend that it's easy, but people who work together, and there's strength in numbers, and there's strength in staying true to your mission, and continuing to do what you know to be lawful. And if you have to make changes, if there are programs that you're doing that are exclusive by race, that you're awarding benefits, and only kids of a certain racial background are eligible to get those benefits, that might be something that's worth talking to a lawyer or a legal group and getting advice on. Is this designed in a way that is okay? Or do we have to make adjustments to it without sacrificing the thing that matters to us most? So it's always worth reviewing what you're doing to make sure that what you're doing complies with federal law. But when you do that, you should be focused on federal law, not on what the administration says out loud or in press releases or even in executive orders.
Thank you, Dan. And here in Chicago, on the same day that CPS released its Blast to Success plan, we had a complaint from the Parents Defending Education group, and then almost to the day, 2 months later, we had the investigation launched by the Department of Education. So just to your point about the coordination between some of these outside groups in the administration. But thank you. Ariel, we're going to turn it back to you. I don't want to call it the $1 million question, the $1 billion question, but talking about some of the early administration actions and with respect to funding. So thank you.
Yes. and thank you for this conversation so far. I'm a big fan of the three branches of government. I think that like laws matter right now, and power of the purse matters right now. And so if you have been paying attention to conversations on Capitol Hill and from the administration, they just released their budget. You have probably seen that there are some anticipated cuts to federal funding that we are currently and very actively fighting back against. There are a couple of general threats that I'll go through first, and then I really want to talk about what's happening right now in the reconciliation package that's moving through the House. So I'll first start on the next slide. Okay, so there are a couple of things that we know are happening as we have seen funding cuts. We know that there are moves to shrink or freeze some discretionary funding that districts got. That was through a lot of the funding freezes and firings that happened at the Department of Education. Additionally, we saw hundreds of teacher prep and research grants that were terminated. We've seen threats to block federal aid, as we've been talking about through the certification process. And as Dan mentioned, Maine was cited as the first target. And then we've seen these broad cuts to staff grants and programming at the Department of Education that is limiting the ability of the department to serve students and pass out grants. We have so far gotten reports that a lot of the big grants that states rely on are still going out, and we're monitoring it really closely because it matters to us that money that's already been appropriated by Congress continues to flow freely to districts, because as we've been mentioning through this call, it is Congress's role as the appropriator to send money. Okay, next slide. Some of the things that we're worried about more generally, we are worried about cuts to title funding and IDEA. We know that in previous Republican budget proposals coming out of the House, there have been extreme cuts to Title I, the elimination of Title III, which supports our English language learners, and cuts or hold studies on Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, so IDEA, which pays for our services for students who receive IEPs in schools. One of the things that we're tracking as we're talking through formula funding, which is title funding, is we are monitoring a push from some Republican states to transition into receiving block grants. And states have been asking for more flexibility when it comes to how they receive federal funds, mostly so that we think that they can move away from some of the most equitable practices in terms of how they distribute the money, right? Title I funding goes to schools with high free and reduced lunch rates. Title III is to support our English language learners, and many red states are hoping that the Department of Education grants them the flexibility to fund what they choose to prioritize, which in really red states like Oklahoma, who have a track record of not supporting equity work, we think that could be really dangerous for some of the most vulnerable populations of students across the state. And so there's two big things that we're tracking right now. So literally right now, as we're having this conversation, there are three committees meeting on Capitol Hill who are all considering major cuts to education funding and to other important services that we know families rely on. The largest cut that they're considering right now, the House Energy and Commerce Committee is considering a large cut to Medicaid across the country through the budget reconciliation process. Just to give you an idea of how many kids rely on Medicaid, 40% of kids across the country rely on Medicaid for healthcare, mental health, and school-based services. And Medicaid is the fourth largest federal funding stream for our public schools. And so when we think about cuts to Medicaid, not only are we talking about the potential for 14 million Americans to lose access to their health care, but we're also looking at serious cuts to things like school counselors, mental health programming in our schools, and continued reduction of programs, that are social emotional learning related, and a lot of cuts to our rural schools who rely heavily on Medicaid for school-based services. So that's quite literally happening in real time, and we're monitoring that pretty closely, very closely. It's on YouTube live right now. And it's something that if you are feeling like taking an action tonight as a result of listening to this call, calling your member of Congress and telling them that cuts to Medicaid would harm kids and families across this country is something that you can absolutely do as a result, or like immediately after you get off of this call. Leave them a message. It's really important that they're hearing from their constituents. It's worth noting that on this whole big, beautiful budget, which is what Trump is calling it right now, it's not that beautiful. I think there's a lot of disputes. The speaker can only lose 3 votes. And there's a lot of people who are moderate Republicans who are dissenting in this moment and saying, no, we are not going to take away healthcare from families. And so there is pushback, and it's more than 3 people who are pushing back right now. So it's really important to continue to put pressure on both your member in the House, but also as this advances, your senators. Additionally, this evening, the Committee on Agriculture in the House is considering major cuts to the SNAP program, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. 1 in 4 children nationwide rely on SNAP to help meet their basic nutritional needs. This would impact Chicago. 40% of Chicago families receive SNAP. The committee is tasked with making a $280 billion cut to the program. It would be the largest cut to SNAP in SNAP's history. I should have noted also that the proposed Medicaid cuts would be the largest cuts to Medicaid in history. And so we're tracking both of these things very closely. And, while you're on the phone with your member of Congress, if you could also tell them that you do not support SNAP cuts. We know that it is a hunger reduction program that hundreds of thousands of kids rely on across the country, and it's something that's worth protecting. Next slide. We know that if federal dollars disappear, this will impact Chicago families immediately. We know that there'll be less abilities for our schools to hire reading and math intervention staff, school counselors, as I mentioned before, and a huge reduction, unfortunately, in supports for English language learning. In terms of cuts that have already happened that are probably already impacting those services, the Office of English Language Acquisition, which is a part of the Department of Education, that whole team was a part of the reduction in force. So there is no federal department that's supporting English language learners with humans in it at this moment. We also anticipate cuts to after-school programs. We are seeing some of those reductions. I mentioned the mental health freezes that happened last week. And as Dan mentioned earlier in the call, we are closely monitoring a conversation about continued cuts to Head Start programming and cuts to the program's budget. Yeah, those are my bad news items on Congress and their budget. But it is always important to remember that 2026 is a midterm election that could change the makeup of Congress. And between now and then, it's very important that we are holding members accountable for delivering for American families and making what is already a very difficult economic time for many families across the country even harder by cutting services that they rely on.
Ariel, I'd be remiss. There's a question that attendee asked specifically around contingency plans. And, in Illinois right now, our state legislator and our governor are working on a budget for next year. So a question is, do you see states that are seeing what's happening in, both the president's skinny budget and seeing what's being discussed right now in Congress, taking steps now to augment or kind of increase funding in any areas to plan for what might come in the months ahead?
Yes, and I think it's always important. I've had a conversation earlier today with a state that was thinking about ways to, they're in a school finance formula conversation. And, it was a conversation where we talked about weighting English language learning supports and funds for English language learners higher in the state formula as a result of an anticipated decrease. But also I think it's, these cuts are going to be hard, sort of regardless of whether or not states are backfilling. And so I think it's also important to just be realistic about, ensuring one that even if your state is considering flexibilities by way of, waivers, it's really important that you have equity and student achievement in mind as they consider that.
The question also want to try to answer specifically around Head Start programs. So understanding potentially the timing on some of our kind of smaller, community-based organizations that provide Head Start, early childhood programming. What could be a timing for that, and do you see anything at the state or local level of trying to supplement funding in those areas, so we don't see pre-K providers going out of business potentially?
Yeah, so there's been some back and forth with the Trump administration on the elimination of Head Start that's noteworthy. Before the president released what we call his skinny budget, there was a draft that was leaked of the Department of Health and Human Services budget that had really big cuts to Head Start in it. It didn't fund Head Start. And I think it said something like the elimination of the program is consistent with the goal of returning education to the states. And so, but that didn't actually end up making it in the skinny budget that the president released. And so I do think that it's worth noting that pushback on Head Start is being heard loudly. And so I think staying connected to your member of Congress about the impact continued Head Start cuts would have on your community is going to be really important as we continue to talk about it.
Thank you, Ariel. Thank you, Dan. I know you guys are we'll return to you all in a little bit towards the end, but we wanted to give a chance for everyone who's been a part of the presentation thus far, before we kind of move further along the presentation to closing and sharing some additional resources. We wanted to hear from you directly. And so we talked about a lot tonight. I think, probably for folks this is new to, and even for myself, our heads are kind of spinning and kind of trying to wrap ourselves around all the different actions that are happening at the federal level, both on the education side, but also in specific areas, as you heard from Ariel, around Medicaid and SNAP, and really programs that that families benefit from here in Chicago. But we wanted to ask a question that after hearing tonight's presentation, which federal development do you think poses the greatest risk to Chicago Public Schools? So you'll see the options. I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll right now. So you'll see some of the options here. So we have the effort to abolish the U.S. Department of Education. We have the threats to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI programs. We also have the weakening or relocating of civil rights enforcement, or I should probably add to that, as Dan talked about, the use of civil rights enforcement to target universities and other entities, other institutions. We also talked about the potential cuts to title funds, IDEA, Head Start. I would add also Medicaid and SNAP to those options as well. And if you're still unsure, and it is fine to be, and maybe it's almost an all of the above type of response, you can also hit not sure. So I hope everyone can see this. We do have this survey is available both in English and Spanish. So I'm going to wait just for a little bit of time for folks to go ahead and respond to that survey. All folks taking that survey, we do have a parent I know from Kids for Chicago's network, Yolanda Williams. Yolanda, I'm going to push to allow you to just to be able to ask your question.
Hi, good evening. I went too fast, and so I actually really wanted to add something, but I guess so we can do all of the above. I was thinking that it was only one thing we could check.
I think in retrospect, as the person who created the survey, I should have had an all the above, but maybe I was taking a force, to force to choose one. But you could also put not sure, Yolanda, if you'd like to.
Well, I put the one that I did already, so I'll just leave it like that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Yolanda.
You're welcome.
Good to hear from you.
Okay.
So I'm going to wait about 20 seconds more. We've got about 60 responses out of the over 100 folks that are here right now. I'm going to call on Catania.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Sorry, Coco is in my background. I'm a mother of 4. All of my children are CPS and early Head Start students here in Chicago. And I just wanted to know, like, with everything that's going on, have we seen any, like, support groups or, okay, we know this is going on, but let's band together to at least ensure this is still happening or we still have, like, coverage in this area? Like, have you seen any of that kind of kick off? Because we see a lot of detriment going on to what is looking like normalcy, So is there anybody that's stepping up and saying, okay, we have a group here that's geared towards helping this, or maybe these are things that you can do just in case you're a school? Like my kids' early Head Start and Head Start program literally got threatened to be shut down within the next couple of months. And so have we seen any groups to say, okay, we're going to band together to do this, or okay, let's start preparing to homeschool, or, because they're steamrolling this.
Thank you, Tom. Dan or Errol, if you guys want to answer that question specifically.
I mean, I would say that that's the place where I have the most optimism about what's possible as we navigate what I would consider to be a moment of extreme uncertainty, is the power and strength of community. I think that that is the most important thing that we can be working on right now, is figuring out where, what assets are in community, and how we can advocate for additional resources for those people. Yeah, I think that's really, really important. And because a lot of the programs that were meant to facilitate some of those things have, been eliminated. So yes, I think absolutely. And I would pass it back to my friends at Kids for Chicago, who I think are one of those groups, right?
Well, we are certainly advocates. We do not provide Head Start program. We are certainly advocates for Head Start programming here. And we know there's been some good work by the Head Start organization in Illinois, kind of getting us all together and just getting us educated on the issue. I do see an early childhood expert here in the state of Illinois. Edna, if I'm going to turn over to you just to share if you were going to respond or if you have a separate question.
Hi there. Yes, happy to jump in again. My name is Edna Navarro-Vidaurre with Berta 5 Illinois. I am over the City of Chicago region, and in partnership with folks across the state. So as Hal mentioned, for sure, the Illinois Head Start Association has been leading the charge across the state. We also have the Early Head Start CEO Roundtable that's been in partnership with the Illinois Head Start folks. Also advocating, getting people to go to their electeds, telling their stories, putting up, window signs and yard signs and, all of that, all of those activities. There's also another group called Every Child Ready Chicago, which is a public-private partnership between the mayor's office, Start Early, and basically all of as many of the early childhood advocates and allies. And they meet on a quarterly basis. So I'm happy to share more information, either through Hal or Dan or whoever, around that.
Thank you. And yes, we can please share it with us, and we can include it in an email for everyone who attended here this evening and as well. Thank you. We are at about about 70% of folks who took the poll, so I'm going to go ahead and just share the results, but it was close. I know some folks are thinking all the above, and maybe that's what we saw in some of the not sures, but it looks like our two biggest concerns that we see around the effort to abolish the U.S. Department of Education, as well as the potential funding cuts. So thank you everyone for taking this poll. This helps us at Kids for Chicago, but also our partners in this program be able to think about potentially going deeper on some of these subjects and some of these topics. So we appreciate everyone filling it out, letting us know what developments are concerning you the most. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dan just to briefly share some of the resources the Education Council has compiled and ways for folks to keep up to date with their incredible content that everyone here who's an education advocate is keeping close tabs on. And also turn it over to Nadia De La Rosa from Kids for Chicago, who will share a bit of information about our next program on federal actions and the impact on Chicago's education system. So Dan, turn over to you first.
Sure. Just real quickly, I mentioned at the beginning that there's this, one of the things that is the need to separate the signal from the noise. Part of the reason there's so much noise and it's so hard to keep track of things is the administration is doing a lot every day, all the time. There's some people describe it as kind of a strategy to flood the zone, right? To just put out so many things all at once that it becomes very hard to pay attention, to keep track, to know, what's important and what's not important. On one day, a couple weeks ago, there were 7 executive orders all about education that came at one time. So I should have said, Education Council, we're a mission-driven education consulting group based in Washington, D.C., and we're proud partners of the folks on this call. We are doing a lot of work to try and keep track of everything that's happening, make sense of it, and then share with the community, with the field, with folks like you, what to make of it. It's very, you all have your families and your jobs and all sorts of responsibilities, and so we hope that some of these resources help you separate the signal from the noise and focus on the signal about what's most important. So on either, if you go to the website, the tiny URL or the QR code will take you to a list of a lot of resources that we're providing. Yep, right there. Oh, actually, can you go back to that, Hal? And someone asked about signing up for a listserv. There's a subscribe button that Hal's pointing to right now. So you can click on that, and then you'll get any resources that we do emailed to you. We only use your information to email you, not for any other reason. And Hal, if you can go back, if you can click out of that and go down, you'll see resources listed right there. The first one is called the Executive Actions Chart. That's this very, very long document that captures everything that's happened with education. Sometimes then the second thing, we put out alerts when something significant happens. We make sense of it and we write it up and put it out there. And then sometimes we do what we call a deep dive, which is a longer piece looking at one particular issue. There's also a tracker that's not showing on the screen right now, and Hal, maybe you can go back to the slides so people can see the QR code. We also have a executive actions tracker. A lot of these executive orders from the president require the government to do lots of things, like within 30 days or within 60 days or 120 days. And that's a lot of deadlines to keep track of. So we've put all of the deadlines in a tracker. And so you can also see, I remember they said that they were gonna, come out with new rules about, college admissions. And when is that due? And you can find it there in the tracker. So we hope those are helpful to you, and please be in touch with Kids First and other folks if there's ever resources that you think would be more helpful, or if you have feedback on what we're providing, because we want to make sure that what we're doing is helpful to you. Thanks, Hal.
I will turn it back over to Nadia De La Rosa from our team here at Kids First Chicago.
Thank you. Good evening, friends, and hello, Miss Yolanda and Catania. Unfortunately, as you can see from these recent headlines, these federal actions are ongoing. And for those of us in Chicago, it's hitting close to home. So just last month, the Trump administration opened a federal investigation into CPS over its Black Student Success Plan, an initiative meant to support Black CPS students through increased investments and programming. And we're seeing the long-lasting effects of Trump's immigration actions, especially for CPS students. These stories make it clear federal actions are continuing to reach into our schools, not just at the funding level, but in ways that affect civil rights, belonging, and how the district supports its students. We'll be picking up these topics and more in part 2 of our webinar series later this month. This next conversation is going to focus on immigration, race-conscious policy, and what they mean for school communities in Chicago. We hope you'll join us again and bring others into the conversation. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. Kids First Chicago, Advanced Illinois, and Educators for Excellence Chicago invite you to join part 2 of our public webinar series on how recent federal actions are reshaping education and what they mean for Chicago families, schools, and communities. The Trump administration's increased immigration enforcement and growing legal attacks on race-conscious programs are creating new risks for students and public schools across the country. This event will focus on 2 important issues: federal immigration actions and how increased enforcement, legal challenges to birthright citizenship, and the rollback of humanitarian protections are affecting student enrollment, attendance, and well-being. Attacks on race-conscious programs and what they could mean for local efforts like the Black Student Success Plan, which is designed to improve outcomes for Black students across CPS. The program will begin with a short overview of each topic, followed by a panel conversation featuring parents, educators, and school leaders who are experiencing these challenges firsthand. We'll spotlight how federal policies are reverberating in Chicago's classrooms and communities and what it will take to support our students during this period of uncertainty. I know, Katanya, you had a question about what kind of things are in place. And so much like Ariel, it's one of those things I'm very confident in is the way that community will come together to take care of each other. Nonetheless, this is all very scary. So we hope you'll join us for this important conversation grounded in real stories, real impacts, and a shared commitment to student success. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Before we wrap up, we'd really appreciate if you could take just a minute or 2 to complete our short survey. Your feedback helps us understand what landed, what could be clearer, and how we can make future webinars even more useful and relevant for you. You can scan the QR code on the screen, or you can click the link that will drop in the chat. Your responses are completely anonymous, and we truly take them to heart. So we really look forward to this feedback. We'll use what you share to shape future programs, topics, and the way we present information. So thank you in advance for taking a moment to let us know what you thought. Again, the link, I believe, has already been put in the chat. So we can take a few minutes to fill that out.
And just an apology, when we were uploading these, it might not have saved fully for the Spanish language version of the surveys. And so we will send this out afterwards in both English and Spanish, but